Okay, let's get into it. Today we are doing a deep dive into what many are calling the final chapter of a 75-year-old story.
That's right, the post-World War II Transatlantic partnership.
And the document that seems to be closing that chapter, it's complex, the rhetoric is, well, it's inflammatory, and the stakes, I think it's safe to say, could not be higher.
Indeed. We're focusing on the new U.S. National Security Strategy, or NSS. It's being called the Trump Doctrine by a lot of the analysts we've been reading, especially those looking at the fallout in European capitals.
And this isn't just a small policy change.
Oh, not at all. This 33-page document is being seen as a systematic, really an ideological break. It throws out that 75-year understanding that bound the U.S. and Europe together.
So our sources for this dive we've pulled from international relations professors, journalists, Europe correspondents, policy analysts. They've all detailed how this strategy seems to signal a clear intent to just drastically reduce the U.S. commitment to Europe.
It's an abandonment, is how some frame it. Effectively leaving the continent to manage its own security, which for some means, leaving it to face Russia on its own.
The shockwaves are already being felt.
Hmm.
So our mission today is to really pull out the core arguments of this NSS. We want to get past the political noise and understand the foundational shift here.
And then we have to look at the consequences, the ripple effects. What does this mean for the war in Ukraine? How can Europe even begin to think about defense autonomy on this timeline?
And we also need to map out the economic leverage points, what our sources are calling the chantage points, the vulnerabilities the U.S. still holds over its former allies.
We're going to give you a clear, impartial look at this. This isn't just a policy document. It's a blueprint for a new global order, and you need to understand the details.
Right. So let's start with the core ideology, the divorce papers, as they're being called.
The best place to start is just how completely it rejects the past. The central idea of this new NSS is America first, but it's redefined. It's not just about protectionism anymore.
It's bigger than that.
It's a complete ideological rejection of global responsibility.
Okay, so when you say rejection of global responsibility, what does that actually mean in strategic terms? What does it look like on the ground?
It means the U.S. is explicitly saying it's no longer interested in being the, quote, hegemonic power or the policeman of the world.
A role it's had since 1945.
Consistently. The sources are really clear on this. The U.S. is pivoting entirely to its own narrow national interests. This document signals the end of burden sharing, the end of acting as a security guarantor based on some kind of shared democratic values.
So all alliances are now just transactional.
Purely transactional. If it doesn't provide an immediate, tangible net benefit to the U.S., it's considered obsolete.
Now, you mentioned the document itself. Analysts have used some pretty harsh language to describe it. I've seen fragmentary, ideological, even written in childish language.
I have.
So if the drafting is that flawed, why should Europe or anyone treat this as a real strategic break? Why not just see it as political posturing?
That's a critical question. And it gets to the heart of the analysis. While the tone, it might lack that polished diplomatic language of past administrations, the strategy itself tells a consistent story. The ideology behind it, the philosophy of the break, is crystal clear.
So the message is consistent, even if the language isn't.
Exactly. It's a dramatic rupture with every U.S. tradition of multilateralism and collective security we've seen for decades. And its hostility towards international institutions is, it's foundational to that consistency.
How does that hostility actually show up in the text? What are they saying?
It's a core argument that the U.S. has to protect its sovereignty above all else. The NSS frames international institutions, and this is everything from the World Health Organization to climate agreements, as entities that have actively undermined U.S. national sovereignty.
Undermined. That's a strong word.
It is, and that they've acted, and this is another quote, to the detriment of the American people. So the U.S. isn't just stepping back from these organizations, it's positioning itself against them. It sees them as competitors, not partners.
Let's pivot a little to the culture war aspect, because this seems to be where European analysts say the document goes beyond policy and starts reading like a far-right pamphlet.
Or an ideological declaration of war.
Right, a declaration of war against the European Union itself, which implies this break isn't just strategic, it's deeply cultural.
The cultural antagonism is, well, it's undeniable. It's why European leaders are so deeply concerned. The NSS uses very specific, very charged language to frame the EU as being, in its view, fundamentally illiberal.
Oh, so.
For instance, one specific complaint is that the EU undermines political freedom through censorship.
Censorship. What are they referring to when they talk about censorship in the EU? That seems like a stretch.
Well, the analysts speculate it's a two-pronged attack. The first part is probably about Europe's digital rules, things like the GDPR or rules aimed at curbing disinformation,
Which the U.S. has always viewed as a barrier to its tech giants.
and an infringement on speech, exactly. The second prong is a bit more obscure, but just as ideological. Some believe it's a reference to internal judicial practices in Europe, like using initials instead of full names in sensitive legal cases to protect privacy.
So they're taking issue with privacy laws.
It seems so. The underlying message is that the EU's entire approach to governance, digital, legal, social, is, in their view, actively anti-freedom and therefore morally suspect.
But the deepest, and from what I've read, the most shocking ideological attack is on European demography. The sources call it the NSS's demographic obsession.
This is where the language gets really visceral. The strategy launches this heavy ideological attack on European culture. It claims that mass migration and cratering birth rates are leading to, and this is the quote, cultural self-murder and civilizational erasure.
Civilizational erasure. I mean, that's not language you expect to find in a national security document. How do they use that idea to justify a strategic boast with Europe?
By framing Europe as internally weak, as a dying civilization. The document explicitly says that if the current trends continue, the continent will be unrecognizable in 20 years or less.
So this is a security analysis based on identity politics.
Absolutely. The argument goes, if the core demographic and cultural identity of our NATO allies is dissolving, then the shared ideological foundation of the alliance vanishes with it.
Why commit blood and treasure to defending a region that, in this view, is destroying itself from within?
That is the question they're posing. It raises this profound strategic question of whether future NATO members will even still be European in a way the U.S. recognizes, or if they'll view the alliance in the same historical light.
And this ties directly into the anti-woke stance we're seeing. The strategy targets diversity, equity, and inclusion DEI, and what it calls woke ideology in Europe.
It claims these are internal strategic weaknesses. It argues these practices have weakened both the U.S. and Europe, that they've replaced meritocracy with a focus on, and the document uses a phrase that translates from Dutch as vermend gediscrimineerd minderheden.
Allegedly discriminated minorities.
Yes. The argument they're making is that this internal cultural preoccupation has eroded the meritocratic strength you need for global competition, especially against a country like China.
So they're basically injecting America's own internal culture wars directly into foreign policy and painting the EU as structurally compromised by them.
It's a very calculated effort.
Okay, so if Europe is being framed as decadent, weak, culturally fading, the U.S. must be focusing its energy somewhere else. Where does the strategy pivot? I'm seeing a revival of a very old idea.
The Monroe Doctrine.
The Monroe Doctrine.
It is a profound historical callback. The strategy clearly concentrates U.S. efforts on the Western Hemisphere. It's a direct nod to the doctrine from 1823.
So for anyone who needs a quick refresher, the original doctrine basically asserted U.S. control over the Americas and told European powers to stay out. So what does reviving that look like in the 21st century?
It means focusing military, economic, and political power entirely on the Americas. The NSS implies this control is backed by military force if needed. They reference, for example, potential troop buildups near unstable regions, and they specifically cite Venezuela as an example.
So it's a massive reallocation of resources.
It's pulling intelligence assets, diplomatic capital, military planning, everything out of other theaters and channeling it all westward and southward into its own backyard.
And this brings us to the critical omission that really defines the entire divorce.
Dog that didn't bark.
Europe is not included in this Western Hemisphere focus at all.
And that exclusion is the strategy's clearest, most devastating signal to Europe. The analysts we read all conclude the same thing. By focusing so intently on the Americas and specific threats in Asia, the NSS implicitly grants Russia a new sphere of influence across the European continent.
The U.S. steps back.
Yeah.
And the vacuum is filled.
It's a return to 19th century great power politics. It's a complete abandonment of the collective security framework that has defined the entire post-Cold War world.
And the document isn't just indifferent to Europe. It seems to be actively trying to interfere with its political unity. The sources describe the NSS as a deliberate navel.
A political bow, yes. A deep invitation to Europe's ultra-right and populist parties. The document itself even refers to them as the Patriots.
This feels like a highly calculated move. a form of strategic destabilization.
It is. When the analysts call it a nival, they mean a deliberate act of political recognition, of encouragement. These populist parties, they're often very loud, but they typically only get 20 to 25% of the vote. They're marginal in many national governments.
So why elevate them? Why give them this kind of recognition in a U.S. strategy document?
Because the strategy sees these groups as allies in its own ideological culture war against the mainstream EU establishment.
So it's a manifestation of the U.S. actually fearing a strong, unified Europe.
That's the interpretation. That by extending a hand to these internal dissenting forces, the U.S. is trying to actively destabilize and maybe even dismantle the European Union from within. It's using Europe's internal divisions as a tool of its own foreign policy.
Which is an incredible reversal.
Mhm.
The U.S. is now essentially supporting the very elements in Europe who want to tear down the alliances the U.S. itself built.
It's a profound break.
So if the U.S. is granting Russia this new sphere of influence and actively trying to destabilize the EU, the most immediate consequence has to be Ukraine.
Absolutely.
Let's look at how the NSS actually frames that conflict.
The language, and what's missing from the language, is incredibly revealing. Our analysis shows Russia is mentioned more than 10 times in the document.
Okay. And Ukraine.
Ukraine is mentioned only 4 times. And here's the critical point.
Yeah.
In none of those 4 mentions is Russia ever referred to as the aggressor. Not once.
Never call the invader.
Hmm.
And that framing is so important because it completely changes the strategic goal, doesn't it? If Russia isn't the aggressor, then the objective shifts from defending a victim to simply ending a fight.
Exactly. The NSS frames the conflict as being prolonged by European stubbornness. It argues that European officials hold unrealistic expectations for the war.
And it claims that despite what the governments are saying, a large European majority wants peace.
Yes. This positions the U.S. as the practical, realistic actor here, the one seeking stability. And it contrasts that with what it portrays as a kind of quixotic European belligerence.
So what's the explicit goal of the strategy then?
A quick truce. And then establishing a workable relationship with Russia.
A workable relationship.
That's the ultimate strategic objective. The strategy basically offers up the U.S. as the necessary broker, the only one who can mediate between Europe and Russia to end the fighting.
Which means using U.S. leverage not to protect Ukraine's interests.
But to facilitate a stable political and commercial arrangement with Russia.
And I imagine Russia was quite pleased with this.
The sources noted immediate approval. The Kremlin publicly endorsed the NSS. They called it, quote, largely corresponding with Russia's own vision of the world.
Of course they did.
And the price for this workable relationship is clearly implied throughout the whole document.
Which is?
That Ukraine must simply accept a loss of territory. Expert analysis concludes this specifically means handing over the Donbas region.
So this is the clearest sign that the U.S. is ready to, as the saying goes, throw Ukraine under the bus.
And with it, the entire existing framework of European security, all to achieve this transactional goal of stability with Russia.
This strategic shift is obviously accelerating the push for negotiations. This is the whole Trump peace plan we've been hearing about.
And he's pushing it hard, publicly. The push is intensely real, and the diplomatic machinery is moving very quickly.
He publicly said he was disappointed that President Zelensky hadn't read his proposal yet.
Yes, while at the same time claiming that, quote, his people love it, and most importantly, that Russia is fine with it, which signals to everyone that the terms on the table already meet Moscow's expectations.
And we know there have been high-level talks involving people like Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff.
Those diplomatic efforts are very substantial. There was a 5-hour meeting with Putin's advisors in Russia before they even moved to direct talks with Ukrainian officials in Florida.
So Europe sees this coming.
Europe is acutely aware of the trajectory. The sources say European leaders are now negotiating on Ukraine's behalf, essentially trying to minimize the inevitable territorial losses, which shows you that they know the U.S. is driving this and that the endgame is capitulation.
But for Zelensky, signing a deal that gives up territory creates a massive, maybe even an existential political threat at home.
A peace deal with Russia could very well ignite a civil war inside Ukraine.
And that's because of the ultranationalist militias.
This is the huge internal vulnerability that complicates everything. Ukraine is highly dependent on these fanatical, well-trained, and very well-armed ultranationalist groups.
The Azov Battalion is probably the most famous one.
But some sources estimate there are up to 80 separate entities. And these are not just disorganized gangs. They are a potent internal security threat to the Ukrainian state itself.
And what makes them such an acute risk to Zelensky?
They have a history of successful anti-government action. You have to remember, they played a key role in the 2014 coup that brought in the current political order.
So they've done it before.
And they're intensely nationalistic and politically motivated. They have threatened to kill Zelensky if he tried to end the war on what they see as unfavorable terms. And that's not a new threat. It dates back to 2019.
So forcing him to sign a deal that cedes territory.
It essentially hands these groups the pretext and probably the popular support they would need to launch another coup against him. So for him, peace with Russia could mean a guaranteed internal conflict.
Now, the analysis of the actual negotiations, it reveals a really fascinating and, frankly, a disturbing detail about European complicity in all this.
Yes. The 28-point peace plan.
A key Russian demand was deliberately removed by the Europeans.
That's right. The original Russian proposal included a demand to ban specific internal Ukrainian groups, what they called narcissistic groups.
Which means the powerful ultranationalist militias we were just talking about.
Exactly. But when Europe adapted the plan for their own negotiations, that specific demand was taken out.
Why? What's the implication there?
The implication, according to the analysts, is that Europe is deliberately reluctant to admit that there is a dangerous internal nationalist problem within Ukraine.
Because
Acknowledging that problem might undermine the moral justification for continuing the fight against Russia. They're essentially choosing to continue the conflict and maintain external alignment over acknowledging and solving a major domestic political and security crisis.
that's a heavy choice.
It is.
Let's shift to the economic friction here. The frozen assets controversy. The 200 billion euros in Russian assets held at Euroclear.
This debate is just explosive because it touches on the fundamental security of the entire global financial system.
The push to seize those assets is seen by critics as undermining that stable relationship Trump wants with Russia.
And many are calling it outright stealing. Seizing sovereign assets sets a potentially catastrophic precedent for international law and, financial confidence.
What's the European view? Who is pushing for this?
It's largely being driven by a faction of European elites who see it as an overcoming strategy, a way for Europe to finance the war effort and support Ukraine without relying on an increasingly unreliable U.S.
But that strategy depends on the conflict continuing.
Structurally, yes. You need the war to justify seizing the assets. The European Central Bank, the ECB, has been vocally opposed to this entire idea. They think it's incredibly unwise.
And their fear is?
Their fear is that if they seize Russian assets, other countries around the world, particularly in the developing world, will pull their reserves out of the Eurozone, out of Western banks.
Because they'll fear their assets could be seized next for political reasons.
And that would destabilize the euro's position as a global reserve currency. So this deep division just highlights Europe's internal struggle between geopolitical necessity and financial prudence.
So all of this, the NSS ideology, the push for capitulation in Ukraine, the fight over frozen assets, it's all pushing Europe into what is being described as a truly existential crisis.
It is.
So this new U.S. strategy, it's not a request. Our sources are clear. It's an ultimatum.
It's an ultimatum. It demands Europe become entirely self-sufficient in its defense, and it sets a hard deadline.
2027.
2027, which is what makes the demand strategically absurd for European military leaders.
Right. It's just not possible.
No. The consensus among military and industrial experts is that the rearmament needed, rebuilding the munition stockpiles, restructuring the entire defense industrial base, it just cannot be done in 3 years.
It's replacing capabilities that were built up over 7 decades.
Exactly. And the consequence for failure, as laid out in the NSS, is stark. The U.S. will pull the plug.
Meaning reduce troops, cease support.
And essentially be handing Europe over to Putin by making it clear the Article 5 guarantee is off the table.
This desperate situation, according to some of the analysts, means Europe needs to collectively draft what they're calling an act of abandonment.
It's a very dramatic, high-stakes historical analogy, but it really captures the gravity of the situation.
It's a reference to the 1581 declaration, the Act of Abjuration.
Where the provinces of the Netherlands formally abandoned Philip II of Spain, their king, because he had failed in his duty to protect them.
So how does that analogy apply to the U.S. today?
The argument is that since the U.S. is actively backing away from its fundamental protection duties under the NATO treaty, and is even actively destabilizing Europe politically, Europe must collectively declare its military and political independence.
Which would mean a complete restructuring of NATO, or maybe forming an independent European defense pillar that doesn't rely on U.S. leadership.
It's a call for sovereign self-determination, but one that's being forced on them by the actions of their primary protector.
But while that's a dramatic idea, European leaders right now are caught in this dilemma of dependence. They're forced to, what, flatter and appease the U.S. administration just to buy time.
They're strategically delaying the inevitable. They're trying to avoid immediate blackmail because of these critical dependencies, the chantage points we mentioned earlier, that keep them tethered to the U.S.
Okay, let's break those down because it really illustrates the scale of the challenge.
Yeah.
The first one is obvious: defense.
Militarily, Europe simply lacks the capacity to honor the Article 5 mutual defense guarantee without the U.S., specifically in two areas. First is the high-end capabilities. Think air-to-air refueling, long-range spy planes, electronic warfare.
And the second?
The second is even more crucial. It's the entire command and control network, C4ISR, as it's called.
Command control, communications, computers, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance.
Right. The U.S. provides the central nervous system for all large-scale NATO operations. Without it, European forces would really struggle to coordinate autonomously.
Then there's the economic reliance,
Right.
energy specifically.
Yes, Europe's reliance on U.S. LNG, liquefied natural gas, became acute after the Nord Stream pipelines were destroyed, and they shifted away from Russian gas. The U.S. became Europe's indispensable supplier.
Which gives the U.S. tremendous leverage over Europe's energy costs and stability.
Absolutely. Any disruption could cripple European industry and cause massive civil unrest.
And the third dependency, which is maybe the scariest one in the digital age, is American tech services, the cloud.
This is a huge, often overlooked vulnerability. European governments, businesses, critical infrastructure, they all rely heavily on American cloud providers. Amazon, Microsoft, Google.
For data storage, computing, all of it.
So if the U.S. were to act punitively, they could, as one source put it, potentially flick us out.
Just turn it off.
And that could lead to a massive loss of critical data, economic paralysis, the collapse of essential government services. It gives the U.S. unparalleled leverage.
So this pressure, this ultimatum, it's forcing a response. Brussels is finally waking up, but the motivation is telling.
The sources are absolutely clear on this. The major increase in defense spending we're seeing, the whole Rearm Europe project, it's being driven by the threat from a potential new U.S. administration, not just by Russia.
It's the American ultimatum that's the real catalyst.
It is.
So what does this push for autonomy actually look like? Experts are urging a rapid shift to a war economy light.
This is the imperative. It can't be business as usual anymore. A war economy light means industrial mobilization within 2 years, focusing on 3 key areas.
Okay.
First, rapidly building up munition stockpiles. Shell production has to increase exponentially.
Second, establishing sufficient air defenses across the entire continent. And third, preparing for independent military operations.
Meaning, Europe has to develop its own logistics and command structures to project power without any U.S. help.
It means a rapid state-sponsored shift of national industrial capacity.
And beyond the military side, Europe needs economic countermeasures to fend off what the sources call the national security strategy of profit.
That's the other half of the equation, economic independence. The NSS isn't just about security, it's about commercial exploitation. Europe has to break its reliance on U.S. LNG and the American cloud.
Which means playing some high-stakes geopolitics.
And being willing to intentionally reduce U.S. profits in Europe to protect European sovereignty.
This sounds incredibly difficult and costly. Are there any concrete steps being taken yet?
Yes, and this is the one silver lining in all of this. The external crisis has accelerated the implementation of major economic restructuring reports that had been sitting on shelves for years. The ones by Mario Draghi and Enrico Letta.
Exactly. Reports focused on improving European competitiveness and strengthening the internal market. The U.S. threat is finally forcing Europe to tackle its own internal weaknesses, especially in digital and industrial sovereignty. The crisis is making long-delayed reforms a strategic priority.
So this push for European unity is necessary, but it stands in stark contrast to the reality in many European capitals, which is political fragmentation.
Yeah.
Dysfunction.
Yes. Let's use the Netherlands as a case study because it's a perfect example of how domestic political failure makes it almost impossible to respond to these huge external crises.
The Dutch political system is described as being structurally stuck.
It's dominated by fragmentation. The largest party only holds 26 seats, which is a historical low. This instability leads to what analysts call a permanent campaign mode.
And what does permanent campaign mode mean for making actual policy?
It means politicians are always optimizing for the next election. They're not making the difficult long-term decisions that are needed, like the industrial restructuring for a war economy light.
And the fragmentation is so bad that the country has spent more time under a caretaker government than an active one since 2021.
Which means no major strategic decisions can be made. The government is perpetually temporary.
And the system makes it worse by excluding large winning parties.
Exactly. The systemic exclusion of a party like the PVV, which won 37 seats, means disenfranchising over 3 million voters. It's fundamentally undemocratic. And by doing that, the system prevents any stable majority from forming, which guarantees political paralysis right when you need a stable government most.
Okay, let's look at a concrete example of this dysfunction. The sources give a detailed case study: the political assassination of the former agriculture minister, Femke Wiersma, over the nitrogen crisis.
It's a devastating microcosm of the entire system's failure.
So Wiersma, from the Farmer Citizen Movement, the BBB, was tasked with solving this hugely contentious nitrogen issue.
And her failure just perfectly illustrates how the bureaucracy, rival politicians, and the media can conspire to undermine someone whose policies challenge the status quo. She walked into a ministry that was notoriously lacking in actual sector expertise among its top civil servants.
And the resistance from that bureaucracy started on day one.
It was fierce. Top civil servants, who were often ideologically aligned with the previous environmental policies, opposed her from the very beginning. There were reports of staff walking out of her introductory meeting in shock at her reality-based proposals.
So her political mandate was hobbled from the inside from the moment she walked in the door.
Yes, by the very bureaucracy she was supposed to be leading.
But the truly shocking detail, the thing that shows the depth of the dysfunction, was the internal sabotage from her own coalition partners, the VVD and NSC.
This is the level of internal betrayal that defines the political moment. Her own partners systematically undercut her. They were reportedly willing to let her party, the BBB, fail publicly on this file just to weaken them politically.
And it gets worse.
It does. They actively collaborated with opposition parties in a private app group.
The app group was called Function Elsewhere.
Yes. And they used it to coordinate attacks to undermine Wiersma's policy motions and votes. This is high-level government backstabbing, prioritizing internal rivalries over solving a national crisis.
And throughout all this, Prime Minister Scoof's leadership was described as completely lacking regie, lacking control.
His failure was absolute. He offered no protection, no clear direction for his minister. Analysts noted that Scoof would often just open and close meetings. He didn't intervene. He didn't mediate the disputes. He didn't enforce decisions.
So this week, hands-off leadership just allowed the sabotage to continue until she was forced out.
Exactly, which exacerbated the entire policy crisis.
This whole Dutch case study seems to highlight a broader systemic failure across European governance. This obsession with forcing the real world to fit flawed models, rather than the other way around.
That is the core disconnect. Policy across Europe, whether it's nitrogen targets, wind farm placements, or anti-car policies in cities, it's often driven by forcing real people, farmers, fishermen, small business owners, to conform to these overly optimistic or badly calibrated scientific models.
And when reality clashes with the model,
policymakers routinely choose to punish reality with fines, regulations, forced restructuring. They'd rather do that than admit their model was flawed or that the assumptions were wrong.
And we see the local impact of this in places like Amersfoort.
Amersfoort is a perfect small-scale example. New parking policies, driven by this anti-car climate rhetoric, were pushed through against the democratic will of 75% of voters in a referendum.
And the result?
The consequences were devastating for local small businesses. They reported an immediate 30 to 40% loss in turnover.
And the local government's response?
They refused to admit error. An absolute refusal. It's driven by a fear of losing face. They are prioritizing their ideological consistency and protecting their flawed model over the economic survival of their own citizens.
And that refusal to adapt, even in the face of clear evidence of harm, really encapsulates the problem.
It's a systemic issue that hampers Europe's ability to tackle any major crisis, internal or external.
It really makes you wonder how a continent that struggles this much with its own internal cohesion and just pragmatic governance can possibly mount the kind of collective existential response that this new U.S. strategy demands.
The new national security strategy is It's so much more than just a policy shift. It's a complete ideological realignment. It fundamentally ends that post-World War II partnership between the U.S. and Europe.
Europe is now facing, as one source put it, a gun to its head. It's been forced into a corner where doing nothing is simply not an option.
The choice is binary and it's brutal. Path one is to try and appease a transactional, unpredictable U.S. leadership that, as we've discussed, views Europe as culturally decadent and politically ripe for destabilization.
And path two is to rapidly embark on the incredibly difficult, profoundly costly path to achieving real military and economic autonomy by 2027.
The sources strongly conclude that for Europe to survive this, to counter the sphere of influence being granted to Russia, it has to shift to a war economy light, and it has to do it immediately.
But given the monumental scale of its dependency on the U.S., for the military command systems, for the cloud technology that holds its critical data, and given the technical impossibility of achieving self-sufficiency by that 2027 deadline, the real question we're left with is one of sacrifice.
That's it. To achieve that autonomy in time, to enact the kind of industrial mobilization and economic restructuring the Draghi and Letta reports call for, it requires moving so far beyond just increasing defense spending budgets.
It demands a level of austerity, of focused resource allocation, of political unity that Europe hasn't seen since the Cold War. The existential question isn't whether Europe can survive, it's whether European leaders are prepared to demand, and more importantly, whether you, its citizens, are prepared to accept the level of sacrifice required for full-scale collective war economy to secure your sovereignty in the next 2 years. What precisely are you willing to give up for European autonomy? That's the real measure of the crisis to come.